That morning began like so many others in the quiet town, a crisp autumn air rolling across the open fields, the kind that told hunters the season had truly arrived. The man was well known along the edge of the forest, a father in his 40s who rarely missed a chance to walk the old trails once the leaves turned. He rose before dawn, packed the same worn canvas bag he'd carried for years, and set his rifle against the door while the coffee brewed. His wife remembered how ordinary everything seemed, how routine his movements were, as if nothing could possibly go wrong. He kissed her softly on the cheek, promised his young son he'd bring back something for dinner, and stepped out into the fog that clung to the tree line. Neighbors recalled seeing his truck parked near the trailhead, a familiar sight when deer season was underway. The trail was one he knew as well as his own backyard, a narrow path that wound between oaks and maples before thinning into marshland. He had walked it dozens of times before, often bringing back venison, sometimes only stories of what he almost had in his sights. That morning carried no hint of alarm, no sign of danger waiting for him in the mist. To those who knew him, he was not careless. He had grown up in those woods, and the compass he carried was said to have belonged to his own father. As the day stretched on, the routine began to fracture. By late afternoon, his wife stood at the kitchen window, glancing every few minutes at the drive, expecting the crunch of gravel under his tires. Dinner simmered untouched on the stove, and his son, restless and eager, waited on the porch steps, watching the sun sink lower behind the hills. Darkness came without his return, and that was when the unease turned to fear. It was not like him to stay out so late, not without word, not without a call. When an hour passed in silence, she picked up the phone with trembling hands and dialed the sheriff's office. The sheriff on duty treated the call with gravity. In rural communities, hunters knew how quickly a simple misstep could become deadly. An officer was dispatched to the trailhead, where the man's truck was still parked in the same spot as morning, locked and undisturbed. His jacket was gone, his rifle absent, the cab showing no signs of a struggle. The officer called back to report the truck was clean, ordinary, but its stillness carried a weight. By then, his wife had arrived at the station, clutching a sweater he had left on the back of the couch, asking over and over if they thought he was lost. The sheriff assured her they would begin a search at once. Within the hour, word spread through the town. Volunteers gathered at the edge of the woods with flashlights and lanterns, their breath visible in the cooling night. They shouted his name into the darkness, pausing between calls to listen for a response. Search dogs were brought in, straining against their leashes as they caught faint traces along the path. Yet, each time they followed the scent, it seemed to dissolve near a creek bend where the mud gave no clear prints. The water there ran shallow but fast, a ribbon of silver glinting under their lights, offering no clue as to where he might have gone. By midnight, the search had grown desperate. Men formed lines, sweeping beams across the underbrush, while women back at the sheriff's office coordinated maps and radio calls. His wife refused to go home, sitting in a chair near the dispatch desk, eyes red, refusing food or rest. The boy sat beside her, holding the small toy rifle his father had given him years before, whispering to himself that his dad had promised he'd be back before dark. No one corrected him. No one wanted to admit what everyone was already thinking. The sheriff's team pressed deeper into the forest as the hours passed, marking trees with strips of ribbon so they would not lose their way back. Still, the woods seemed untouched, undisturbed, as though the man had never entered them at all. There were no broken branches, no dropped belongings, no signs of a campfire or a hunter's rest. Each volunteer began to feel the weight of the silence, the way the forest seemed to absorb their shouts without echo. One man later said it felt as if the woods were swallowing sound itself. By dawn, after nearly 12 hours of searching, no trace had been found. The sheriff called for a pause, urging the volunteers to rest and return with daylight. Families shuffled home in silence, some still whispering that perhaps he had walked out another way and would appear any moment at his house. But when morning came and he was still gone, hope began to fracture. His wife, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cold coffee cup, stared at the empty chair across from her. She told deputies later that the silence of that morning was worse than any fear. It felt like the moment the world had tilted into something unnatural. The community, still shaken, returned to the trailhead again that second day, determined not to leave a neighbor lost. More volunteers arrived, more dogs, more equipment, and yet the woods gave nothing back. It was as if he had vanished into the fog without leaving behind a single thread to follow. For his family, the terror was not in knowing he was gone, but in not knowing why or how. That question, unanswered, would haunt them from the very first night onward, laying the foundation for years of grief and speculation that would only deepen with time. By the second morning, the missing father's name was on everyone's lips. The sheriff had called for volunteers, and the response was overwhelming. Men arrived, still in their hunting clothes. Women brought food and thermoses of coffee, and older children stood along the roadside holding lanterns. The trailhead, once just another quiet entry into the woods, had become a gathering place filled with anxiety. People lined up, ready to walk shoulder to shoulder through the trees in search of any trace that might explain where he had gone. The man's truck still sat in the same place it had been found the night before, a red pickup with mud splashed high on the tires. Its presence there felt unsettling, as though it were waiting for its owner to return at any moment. The sheriff ordered the vehicle examined again. The doors were locked, the windows intact, and the inside undisturbed. His rifle, jacket, and gear bag were missing, meaning he had taken them into the woods. The vehicle provided no clue, only the unsettling confirmation that he had truly entered the trail that morning. The first search parties moved in lines, marking their progress with strips of bright orange ribbon tied to tree branches. Their calls echoed through the valley, the man's name carried on the cold air before vanishing into silence. The dogs pulled eagerly at their handlers' leashes, sniffing along the ground. At first, there was hope. They barked and strained near the muddy start of the path, noses pressed into the earth where boot prints should have been. Yet, as the trail deepened, that trace began to fade. The mud carried no distinct boot marks, no clear impression that could be tied to him. It was as though the forest had swallowed the path behind him. Hours stretched into the day, the groups pushing farther, their voices growing hoarse. Near the bend of a shallow creek, the dogs became excited, pacing in circles, whining as if they sensed something lingering there. Searchers leaned over the water, their lights sweeping across the current, but the creek revealed nothing. The rocks along the bank were slick with moss, offering no print, no scuff, no sign a man had passed. When handlers urged the dogs onward, the animals grew confused, wandering without direction before sitting down as though the trail had ended. The scent simply vanished into the air. For the family waiting at the command post, this uncertainty was unbearable. His wife stood with arms wrapped tightly around herself, refusing to leave, her eyes fixed on every deputy who returned from the woods, as if one might finally bring the words she dreaded but needed to hear. Their son sat quietly on the hood of a neighbor's car, clutching a canteen his father had given him, watching the ribbons of orange fluttering in the distance. Each time a voice called his father's name, he flinched as though he expected an answer to come back. None did. As evening approached, the sheriff addressed the group, his tone calm but heavy. They had covered several miles of terrain without finding even a scrap of clothing, a bullet casing, or a broken branch. No one wanted to admit it aloud, but the silence of the forest was unnatural. Experienced hunters shook their heads quietly, saying it was strange for someone who knew the land so well to leave no trace behind. Some muttered theories. Perhaps he had followed an animal deeper in and become lost. Perhaps he had slipped into the creek and been swept further downstream. But there were no signs of a struggle, no drag marks, no blood. Just absence. That night, more deputies joined the search, sweeping the creek with spotlights, probing the undergrowth with poles, but the woods gave nothing back. Helicopters with thermal imaging were requested, but dense tree cover limited their reach. The sheriff knew the longer a person was missing in conditions like this, the less likely survival became. Yet the family clung to fragments of hope. His wife repeated over and over that he was strong, that he had a compass and would find his way back. His son whispered the promise again that his father had said he would be home before dark. As the second night fell, the volunteers reluctantly left the woods, their flashlights disappearing one by one as the darkness grew heavier. Only deputies remained, posted along the trail and creek, listening for anything, a snapped branch, a call for help that might break the silence. But the woods remained still. It was as if the man had stepped off the trail and simply ceased to exist. The uncertainty was suffocating. Death, at least, brought a body, an explanation, a ritual of closure. Here there was none. No note tucked beneath a windshield wiper, no rifle leaning against a tree, no bloodied jacket caught on a branch. Only the cold certainty that he had entered the woods and never walked out again. For those who loved him, that absence was worse than death itself. It was a void that left them clinging to every new rumor, every faint lead, desperate for answers that refused to come. And in that void, suspicion began to take root, laying the groundwork for darker theories that would follow. In the days that followed the fruitless search, the town's hope began to fray. What had started as a desperate effort to rescue a missing father now shifted toward something heavier, more uncertain. The sheriff held daily briefings, telling reporters and neighbors that the search continued, but behind closed doors, investigators were divided. One camp clung to the idea that he was lost, injured, maybe trapped somewhere beyond the mapped trails. The other began whispering a darker suspicion that this disappearance was not an accident at all. Those who believed he was lost pointed to the sheer size of the forest. The woods stretched for miles, crossing state lines with dense marshland that swallowed tracks and swallowed sound. Even an experienced hunter could misstep, twist an ankle, or strike his head on a fall. In that scenario, he might be lying somewhere still alive, waiting for help. But each passing day made that theory harder to sustain. Food would be scarce, nights dropped below freezing, and despite hundreds of boots combing the terrain, not a single clue had surfaced. The others, though, leaned toward foul play, or worse, that the man had staged his own vanishing act. Investigators quietly noted his finances were strained. A small business he had invested in had folded earlier that year, leaving him with debts he hadn't spoken much about. Some suggested he may have used the hunt as cover, stepping away from his old life and beginning anew under another name. But to his wife, that idea was unbearable. She insisted he would never abandon his son, that no amount of debt or hardship could have driven him to walk away from his family. Still, suspicion is hard to silence once it begins to circulate. A deputy uncovered records of a heated land dispute between the man and another hunter from the neighboring county. The two had clashed over hunting rights and boundaries, their argument once escalating in public, where others overheard threats traded back and forth. That man was questioned, his truck examined, but no evidence tied him to the disappearance. The theory lingered nonetheless, whispered in diners and barbershops, each retelling sharpening the edge of speculation. Even the marriage was not spared from rumor. People began to ask pointed questions about arguments overheard through thin walls, about the long hours he spent away from home during previous seasons. Was he faithful? Was he content? Did the strain of family life push him to something reckless? His wife, already shattered by his absence, now found herself defending his character, denying whispers that painted him as an unfaithful man or a deserter. Each denial seemed only to deepen the town's curiosity, as though grief itself made her suspicious in their eyes. The son, too young to understand the cruelty of gossip, bore the weight in quieter ways. At school, classmates repeated what their parents said at the dinner table. Some told him his father had simply run away, others that he'd been killed and dumped somewhere no one would ever find him. Each version tore at the boy differently, leaving him withdrawn, clinging to the last memory of his father's promise. For investigators, the lack of physical evidence was the most troubling detail. If this were a staged disappearance, why leave behind the truck? Why take the rifle and gear but vanish without using them? If it were foul play, why was there no trace, no drag marks, no blood, no sign of a struggle? The creek remained the only anomaly, the place where the dogs lost their trail, but repeated sweeps revealed nothing. It was as if the man had walked into the water and dissolved into the current. Behind the scenes, the sheriff admitted frustration. Each theory had cracks. The forest accident theory faltered against the sheer emptiness of the search. The staged disappearance theory clashed with the man's devotion to his son and his lack of preparation for a new identity. The foul play theory demanded evidence that simply wasn't there. And yet, one of these explanations had to be true. The weight of that uncertainty left the community restless, turning every conversation into speculation, every neighbor into a suspect in someone else's mind. The Mann family felt the fracture most deeply. His wife received calls from relatives urging her to move on, others urging her to demand the search be intensified, as though she bore responsibility for the outcome. The boy grew quieter, spending hours staring at the woods behind their home, as if willing his father to step back through the trees. The house itself grew heavy with silence, meals left uneaten, the air filled with what-ifs. What no one could agree on was which story to believe. Was he lost and perishing alone? Had he chosen to disappear, leaving behind the people who loved him most? Or had someone out there taken his life and hidden the truth so well that even the best searchers in the county couldn't uncover it? Each answer was devastating in its own way, but without proof, all the family had were rumors. By the third week, the official search scaled back. Deputies were sent to other calls, volunteers returned to work, and the trailhead that once teemed with life fell silent again. The ribbons tied to the trees remained, faded by rain and wind, fluttering as reminders of the lines that had been walked over and over without resolution. The family was left to sit with the most haunting possibility of all, that they might never know. That uncertainty, more than death itself, carved into their lives like a wound that refused to close. And in the void left by answers, darker theories would only take deeper root. Winter came early that year, a heavy snow settling over the valley and covering the ribbons still tied to the trees. What had once been bright markers of hope now sagged beneath ice, their color fading as the weeks slipped by. With each storm, the woods seemed to swallow any remaining trace of the missing father, erasing paths, footprints, and the faintest possibility that he might be found alive. The search had long since thinned. Deputies were reassigned, volunteers returned to their routines, and the once bustling trailhead became quiet again, the gravel lot empty save for the marks where his truck had sat for weeks. Through those months, the family's world shrank. Every day began with the same question, and every night ended with the same silence. His wife clung to patterns, keeping the porch light on, setting his plate at the table, as if refusing to allow absence to dictate their lives. But the rituals grew hollow with time, and neighbors whispered it was only hurting her more. Still, she visited the trailhead weekly, standing at the place where his truck had been found. Sometimes she left food in the cab before it was towed away, convinced that if he returned, he would need something warm waiting. To her, that small act was a lifeline, a refusal to accept that he had vanished forever. The boy absorbed his grief differently. Withdrawn, quieter with each passing week, he repeated his father's last words until they became almost a chant. "I'll be back before dark." Teachers noticed the change, his grades slipping, his drawings filled with trees, rivers, and empty roads. Other children avoided him, unsure of what to say, the mystery surrounding his father too heavy for their age to understand. At home, he wandered the yard, staring into the woods as though listening for a voice that never came back. The sheriff's office held on as long as resources allowed. For weeks, they followed up on tips from hunters and hikers who claimed to see shapes in the woods or hear gunshots that might have been distress calls. Each lead unraveled. A supposed footprint turned out to be a deer track. A reported campfire was the remnant of another hunter's site. By December, with no evidence and no new direction, the sheriff announced the case was being suspended. On paper, it became unsolved. To the family, it felt like a death sentence without a body. That word, unsolved, hung over the household like a storm cloud. It meant no more deputies would be combing the trails, no helicopters would sweep the woods, no dogs would sniff the creek banks. It meant his wife was left with the silence, alone in her routines, repeating them not because they made sense, but because they were all she had left. Friends tried to help, bringing food, offering comfort, but even kindness eventually faltered under the weight of something that would not change. One by one, visits slowed, and the family became isolated within their grief. In town, the rumors never stopped. Some held firm to the belief that he had simply gotten lost, that the forest had claimed him like it had claimed others before. Others kept whispering darker stories, that he had walked away from his family, or that someone had silenced him and hidden the truth where no one could find it. Each version twisted the family's pain, forcing them to hear their loved one spoken of not as a victim, but as a cautionary tale or a ghost story. His wife began avoiding the grocery store, sending her sister instead, unable to face the stares or the half-hearted condolences from neighbors who no longer knew what to say. By late winter, even the trail itself seemed to surrender its secrets. Snow buried the ground where searchers had once scoured every inch. The creek froze over, its banks blanketed in ice. Each storm layered silence over the landscape, making it impossible to know what had been hidden beneath. When spring came and the snow melted, no new evidence emerged. The woods had given nothing back, not a shred of clothing, not a rifle, not even the charred remains of a campfire that might explain where he had stopped. It was as though he had been swallowed whole. The family's home changed too. His tools remained untouched in the shed, the grass outside grew long, and the small repairs he had always handled went unfinished. The boys' birthdays came and went without his father, each candle blown out in silence. On anniversaries of the disappearance, his wife returned to the trailhead, laying her hand on the bark of the first oak tree, whispering his name into the quiet. Sometimes she swore she heard an echo, but there was never an answer. Over time, hope dimmed not with a bang, but with a slow erosion. Every day without answers felt like another small death. For his wife, the hardest part was not the possibility that he was gone. It was the certainty that she did not know how. She could not grieve a body that had not been found. She could not explain to her son why the man he loved most had not come home. That silence left them both suspended between denial and despair. And yet, even as the case went cold, even as years began to creep forward, the trailhead never lost its hold on them. It remained the place where he was last seen, the only landmark in a story that had no ending. For his wife, it was where she kept waiting, convinced that one day the woods would give her something, anything that might explain. For his son, it became a shadow, a wound carried into adolescence. And though the town moved on, though the sheriff's office filed it away as just another mystery without closure, the family lived inside the silence. What they could not know was that the answer was still buried out there, hidden under the very ground they had walked over and over, waiting to resurface in a way no one could have imagined. 14 years is a long time for silence to settle. In that span, the man's disappearance transformed from an active investigation into a story told in whispers. Hunters warned newcomers not to wander too far beyond the marked trails, citing him as proof of how quickly the woods could claim someone. Children dared each other to bike out to the trailhead and stand where his truck once sat, trading nervous laughter in the face of a place their parents told them to avoid. His name lingered in the town like a ghost, never fully gone, but rarely spoken aloud. For the family, the years stretched like an open wound. His wife aged beneath the weight of absence, lines deepening around her eyes not just from time, but from the endless strain of not knowing. She kept his belongings boxed in the attic, unable to throw them away, but equally unable to display them. The son grew into a man with his father's features, but carried an emptiness that others noticed in his quiet demeanor. Every birthday, every milestone was marked by the reminder that someone was missing. The unanswered question of what had happened never left them, turning each holiday into a painful reminder of absence. By the time the case reached its 13th year, It was little more than a dusty file in the sheriff's office. Deputies new to the force had only heard the story secondhand, the old ribbons along the trail long since disintegrated. The woods had moved on, overgrowth covering the paths, storms felling trees across the routes where search parties once walked. It seemed unlikely that the truth would ever come out. Then, nature itself intervened. The summer of the 14th year brought a drought that locals had not seen in decades. Creeks ran thin, the marshlands dried and cracked, and animals that depended on the wetlands moved deeper into the forest. What had once been dense and impenetrable terrain suddenly revealed itself in unexpected ways. A small marsh near the old trail, the same region where search dogs once circled and lost the scent, shrank into hardened mud and shallow puddles. It was there, on an August morning, that a hiker stumbled upon something strange. Drawn off the path by curiosity, he noticed a faint glimmer in the cracked mud. Kneeling down, he brushed away dirt until his hand closed around a small brass object, tarnished but unmistakably man-made. The piece fit neatly in his palm, its surface weathered but intact. As he turned it over, he noticed faint scratches etched into the back, initials, barely legible but clear enough to read. They matched the name of the man who had disappeared 14 years earlier. It was a compass. The hiker carried it to the sheriff's office, not entirely certain of its significance, but the deputies who handled it recognized the initials immediately. Within hours, word spread through town that something belonging to the missing father had surfaced after all these years. His wife was called in to confirm it, and the moment she saw the compass, her hands trembled. She remembered it clearly, the way he carried it on every hunting trip, the story he told about it being passed down from his own father. There was no doubt. This was his. For the first time in over a decade, the silence cracked. The compass reignited everything the family thought had been buried. Old grief surged back, sharper than before, because the object suggested that he had been there, in that marsh, in those very woods where they had searched over and over. The fact that it had lain beneath the mud all these years raised painful questions. Had they walked past it? Had they been so close to answers and missed them? Investigators reopened the case. The marsh was cordoned off, and forensic teams began combing through the area, digging beneath the dried earth for any trace of what else might remain. The compass was carefully bagged, photographed, and analyzed, though there was little more to glean beyond its identity. Still, it was proof, a tether pulling the story out of legend and back into reality. For the family, it was both a relief and a torment. Relief that something of his had finally surfaced, but torment that it reopened the mystery instead of closing it. The community buzzed with theories again. Some believed the compass had simply been dropped and lost that first day, explaining why the dogs had lingered near the creek. Others wondered if it had been hidden on purpose, buried out of sight until drought revealed it. For the sheriff's office, the location was too important to ignore. They expanded the search area, probing deeper into the marshland that was now exposed, hoping. The compass was not the only thing waiting to be found. For the son, now grown, holding the compass was like reaching across time. He ran his fingers across the initials, imagining the last time his father must have touched it. It was the first physical connection he had been given in 14 years. He told investigators that if the compass had surfaced, then maybe the woods were ready to return more. He said it with a quiet certainty that unsettled those who heard it, as though the forest itself had chosen when to give back its secrets. And in a way, he was right, because what began with that single glint of brass and cracked mud would soon unravel into something much darker, something far more disturbing than an accident or a man lost to the elements. The compass was not the ending. It was only the beginning of the truth, finally clawing its way back to the surface. The discovery of the compass forced the sheriff's office to do something they had not done in years: reopen the file. What had long been considered a closed chapter, stamped with the word unsolved, was now active again. Deputies pulled boxes of evidence from storage, photographs yellowed with age, maps with fading marker lines, statements from volunteers who had walked the woods until their voices were hoarse. The case that had gathered dust for over a decade was suddenly alive, and at its center was a single object that should never have reappeared: The compass was formally examined and photographed. Its tarnished surface told the story of years buried beneath soil and water, yet the initials carved into its back were still visible. When the son, now grown, was brought in to confirm its identity, he didn't hesitate. His voice cracked as he ran his thumb over the letters, recalling the way his father had carried it on every trip, calling it his guide when the trails grew unfamiliar. Holding it again was like touching a ghost. For him, it wasn't just evidence, it was proof that his father had truly been there, and that something had stopped him from ever coming back. Investigators returned to the marsh with forensic teams. The drought had revealed ground not walked upon in decades, soil baked into a crust that cracked beneath their boots. Near where the compass had been found, searchers uncovered something else, a fragment of rotted canvas, faded and brittle, its fibers breaking apart under the slightest touch. It looked like the remains of a backpack, the kind a hunter might sling over his shoulders with supplies. Though degraded, it was consistent with what the missing man had been carrying 14 years earlier. Encouraged, the team began to grid the area, carefully digging and sifting through layers of earth. Within days, they found faint discolorations in the soil, dark patches that, under testing, proved to be remnants of burned wood and ash. A campfire had once been made there. It was shallow, no more than a few inches deep, buried under years of sediment. To the investigators, this was both promising and chilling. If he had built a fire, it suggested he had been alive for some time in that spot. But if that were true, why had no one found him during the extensive search? And why had nothing else remained? News of the discovery spread quickly. Reporters returned to the small town, setting up cameras near the trailhead, interviewing neighbors and former volunteers who had once combed those woods. The story was resurrected in the public eye, no longer just a local legend, but a case with tangible evidence. For the family, this sudden surge of attention was like reopening a wound. His wife, older now, found herself once again on television, speaking about the man she had lost. She admitted that seeing the compass broke her heart all over again, proof of his presence, but still no answers as to his fate. For the son, the media attention was more complicated. He had grown up in the shadow of the disappearance, his childhood defined by whispers and speculation. Now, as an adult, he was thrust into the spotlight as the man asked to verify what had belonged to his father. The compass became a symbol he carried not just for himself, but for the entire community, a reminder that the story was unfinished. He told reporters he wanted the truth, no matter how painful it turned out to be. The sheriff's office echoed that sentiment, but privately expressed unease. The evidence didn't just suggest a man lost to the woods, it hinted at something more deliberate. The compass had been found buried, not left in plain sight. The backpack fragment wasn't scattered by animals, but pressed into the mud, as though concealed, and the campfire ashes raised the question of whether he had been waiting for help, or if he had been with someone else. As speculation mounted, the family's grief resurfaced in ways they hadn't anticipated. His wife admitted she had spent years training herself to live with the silence, to accept that there would never be answers. Now, with every headline, every camera, the questions returned, louder than ever. Had he suffered out there alone? Had someone been with him? Was there more buried beneath the marsh, still waiting to be unearthed? The discovery shifted the town's mood as well. What had been a cautionary tale turned into a mystery that demanded resolution. Hunters debated whether the man had stumbled into danger or met with foul play. Old names resurfaced in gossip, the rival he had argued with, the debts he had carried, the friends he had trusted. People once again turned to the family with prying questions, as if the compass had resurrected not only the man's memory, but the suspicion that his disappearance had not been what it seemed. For the sheriff, reopening the case meant revisiting every angle that had once led to dead ends. But this time, there was something concrete. A compass, initials carved by hand, a fragment of a backpack that had once held supplies, ashes buried beneath years of silence. Each discovery pointed to the same chilling conclusion, that the truth of what happened was still hidden in those woods, waiting for someone willing to dig deep enough to uncover it. And as the marsh continued to give back what it had buried, investigators knew the most haunting discoveries might still be ahead. The marshland, once drained of mystery by years of silence, began to yield its secrets slowly. After the compass and the rotted canvas had been unearthed, investigators knew they had to push deeper. A forensic team marked off a larger grid and began the careful process of excavation, inch by inch, removing layers of hardened soil that had not seen daylight in over a decade. What they found at first seemed unremarkable: stones, roots, animal bones. But then, just beneath a dense patch of clay, something unmistakable surfaced. The first discovery was a fragment of bone. At a glance, it was weathered, discolored, almost indistinguishable from the surrounding soil. But forensic anthropologists knew the difference immediately. The texture, the density, it was human. Work stopped. The site was sealed tighter, and law enforcement stood guard as specialists moved in. Slowly, over the course of several days, more pieces emerged: a femur, rib bones, and fragments of a skull. Each fragment carefully catalogued, each one a grim confirmation of what the family had dreaded for years but never had the proof to face. When the remains were taken into the lab, hope flickered briefly that perhaps they would belong to someone else, another lost hunter, another person claimed by the forest. But dental records told a different story. The teeth matched. The fragments were his. 14 years after he had walked into the woods and vanished, the missing father had finally been found. The news hit the family with a crushing finality. His wife, who had spent years hovering between denial and grief, now had certainty. But it was not the certainty she had ever wanted. For their son, grown now into a man, the revelation carved deeper than silence ever had. For years he had whispered his father's last words, clung to the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he had survived somewhere. That hope collapsed the moment the sheriff stood in their living room and told them the remains had been identified. But the bones told a story that was not simple. Forensic analysis revealed something that shifted the entire direction of the investigation. The remains showed no signs of prolonged exposure to the elements. They were not scattered or chewed by animals, as would be expected if he had died of natural causes and been left unprotected. Instead, the bones bore fractures, clean, deliberate, and consistent with blunt force trauma. The shape and depth of the damage suggested blows to the skull and ribs. This was not an accident. It was not the forest claiming another life. It was violence. That discovery reframed everything investigators thought they knew. For 14 years, theories had revolved around accident, disorientation, or a man who may have staged his disappearance. Now those possibilities collapsed under the weight of evidence. This had not been a man lost to the woods. This had been a man struck down. His death had been inflicted by human hands. The sheriff called in homicide detectives from the State Bureau, shifting the case from missing persons into something darker. For the first time, they began to consider suspects, motives, and opportunities. Old files were reopened, names underlined in fresh ink, neighbors he had quarreled with, hunters who had argued over territory, even family disputes that had been whispered about but never proven. The silence of the forest was replaced by the noise of suspicion. The community reacted with shock. Many had long accepted the story of an accident, a hunter who had simply gone too far and never come back. The idea that one of their own had killed him was harder to swallow, yet impossible to ignore. Rumors surged through the town once more, just as they had in the early days of the disappearance, only now fueled by the certainty of murder. Every remembered argument, every financial dispute, every old grudge was recast in a new light. For the family, the revelation was cruel in its duality. They had long begged for closure, but closure had arrived with the knowledge that someone had chosen to take him from them. His wife could no longer cling to the belief that he had simply lost his way. Her husband had been struck. His life ended not by chance, but by violence. Their son, who had carried his father's compass in his mind like a guiding symbol, now carried the weight of knowing that the compass had not led his father astray. Another man had. Investigators returned to the marsh, searching for more evidence. They scoured the soil for tools, for traces of clothing or weapons that could explain the blows. But time had erased much. What remained were only fragments, partial answers pointing toward a brutal truth, but not yet revealing who had delivered it. Still, the evidence had shifted everything. The sheriff, once resigned to filing the case away as unsolved, now stood before the cameras declaring it a homicide investigation. The tone in his voice was different, firm, grim, resolute. This was no longer a ghost story about a man swallowed by the woods. It was a murder case, one that would reach back across 14 years of silence to unearth not just bones, but secrets buried in the lives of those who had known him. And though the family finally had proof of what happened, the most haunting question of all still lingered. If the father's body had been hidden for so long, then who had put him there? And why had the forest been left to guard the secret for nearly a decade and a half? The compass had led them to his remains, but the truth of who wielded the weapon that ended his life was still waiting to be revealed. With the remains confirmed and the fractures pointing toward blunt force trauma, investigators turned their focus not just to the forest, but to the man's life itself. If someone had killed him, then the answers would not only be buried in the soil, but in the histories of those who had known him best. Detectives began pulling old reports, revisiting statements long filed away, and seeking out witnesses whose memories had dulled but not disappeared. What emerged was a portrait of a man both respected and resented, a figure around whom tensions had simmered years before his disappearance. The first lead centered on a boundary dispute. Several witnesses recalled arguments between the missing father and another hunter from the neighboring county. The two had clashed repeatedly over land access, their disputes sometimes spilling into public view. One local still remembered a shouting match at the general store where words had escalated into threats. That man had been questioned back in the early days of the search, but without evidence, nothing tied him to the disappearance. Now, with homicide on the table, his name returned to the forefront. Detectives tracked him down, older and quieter than when the feud began, but still carrying the same resentment when the subject was raised. He denied involvement, yet his tone carried the weight of old anger that could not be dismissed. Other voices brought forward rumors of something more personal, whispers of an affair resurfaced, allegations that the missing father had grown close to another woman during his long hours away hunting. Whether true or only gossip twisted by years, it added another layer of motive. Jealousy and betrayal, after all, often turned dangerous. For investigators, this angle was impossible to ignore. They interviewed those connected to the rumor, piecing together timelines, but as with so much else, it remained smoke without fire. Still, the possibility that his disappearance had roots not only in disputes over land, but in the intimate fractures of his personal life, unsettled the family. Even within the family itself, contradictions emerged. His son, now a man himself, sat across from detectives and spoke with a bitterness he had carried since childhood. He admitted his father was not the saint some remembered. He had been strict, sometimes harsh, with moods that turned violent in bursts. While the son had loved him, he also feared him, and that fear had shaped his memories as much as affection had. For detectives, these words complicated the case. They were no longer searching only for a victim. They were tracing the shadows of a man whose life had been layered with conflict. The compass, too, began to shift from a symbol of guidance to a piece of evidence that demanded explanation. Found buried apart from the body, its location suggested more than coincidence. Why had it not been discovered with the remains? Had it slipped from his pocket in a struggle? Or had someone intentionally hidden it, pushing it into the mud to obscure the scene? The fact that it resurfaced only when drought cracked the marsh raised chilling questions. Perhaps it had been left where it could never be found, deliberately separated from his body as if to erase his presence. The object once seen as sentimental proof of his identity was now treated as a clue pointing toward betrayal. For his wife, the renewed focus on these darker parts of her husband's life was agonizing. She had already endured years of whispers, and now detectives were digging up every rumor, every argument, every moment of suspicion. Neighbors approached her with half-remembered stories, each one carrying the sting of accusation. She told investigators she wanted the truth, no matter how painful, but privately admitted she feared what they might uncover. The idea that her husband's death had come at the hands of someone he knew, perhaps even trusted, was almost too much to bear. The town itself was unsettled by the new direction of the case. For years they had accepted the story of a man lost to the woods. Now they were asked to consider that he had been betrayed by human hands. Old rivalries were re-examined, friendships questioned, and the sense of safety that once surrounded their small community fractured. People began to recall things differently, remembering arguments they had dismissed at the time, remarks that now seemed weighted with menace. Detectives noted how the case circled less around misadventure and more around betrayal. The compass was not just a trinket, it had become a silent witness, a clue that suggested intent. If it had been deliberately hidden, then the act was not one of panic, but of concealment. Whoever had struck the fatal blows had not wanted the truth discovered. And yet, after 14 years, the forest itself had betrayed the secret, giving back the one object that had led them to the body. For the family, the shift was devastating. They were no longer being asked to grieve a man lost. They were being asked to accept that someone had chosen to end his life. And the circle of suspects was uncomfortably close. Neighbors, fellow hunters, even old friends. The investigation, once about rescue and recovery, was now about betrayal. It was no longer a question of whether he had been killed, but of who had wielded the weapon and why. The silence that had defined their lives for 14 years had finally broken, but what came through it was not peace. It was suspicion. And with suspicion came the creeping realization that the darkest truth was still waiting, closer to home than anyone wanted to believe. Detectives knew the truth would not surface from the soil alone. The compass and the bones had given them cause, but not names. To find the person responsible, they turned back to the one resource still left to them: memory. They began knocking on doors, interviewing locals who had been present at the time of the disappearance. Many were older now, their recollections softened by years, but some carried details that, when pieced together, began to point in a single direction. Again and again, one name surfaced: a man who had once been considered a close friend of the missing father. The two had hunted together for years, often seen side by side during the season, but their friendship had not been without tension. Locals recalled sharp words exchanged over boundaries, accusations of trespassing onto the wrong parcel of land. At the time, no one had thought it could lead to anything more serious. After the disappearance, this man had been questioned, but his answers were vague, and with no evidence tying him to the case, investigators let him go. Within a year, he had moved out of state, leaving behind whispers that perhaps he had wanted to distance himself from the tragedy. Now, with fresh evidence, detectives tracked him down. He was older, his hands unsteady, his life quieter than before. When confronted, he initially repeated the story he had always told, that he had not been with the missing father that day, that he had no idea what had happened. But investigators pressed harder this time, laying the compass and photographs of the remains before him. They told him what the fractures on the bones revealed, that his old friend had not died by accident. The weight of the years and the evidence he could no longer explain away began to crack his resolve. After hours of questioning, the story spilled out. He admitted he had been with the missing father on the day of the disappearance. They had entered the woods together, rifles slung over their shoulders, but the camaraderie of old friends gave way to hostility. Once again, the argument rose over land, where one's rights ended and another's began. Voices grew louder, tempers sharper, until in a moment of fury, he raised his rifle not to fire, but to strike. The butt of the weapon came down hard, and his friend crumpled instantly. The silence that followed was heavier than anything he had ever felt. Panic took over. He realized immediately what he had done. There was no breath, no movement. Terrified of prison, of what the town would say, of what his own family would endure, he dragged the body into the marsh. He concealed it beneath mud and brush, convinced the swamp would hold the secret forever. The compass, he admitted, had fallen from his friend's pocket during the struggle. In a desperate attempt to cover his tracks, he buried it deeper into the muck, hoping that if anyone ever searched, they would not find it. For 14 years, that decision kept him hidden. The confession stunned investigators, not because of its violence, but because of its simplicity. A friendship destroyed over a boundary line. A life ended in an instant of rage. No elaborate plot, no stranger in the woods, only betrayal between two men who had walked those trails together for years. The very ordinariness of it was what made it so haunting. When news of the confession broke, the community reacted with disbelief. Many had grown up hearing both men's names spoken side by side, their friendship considered a fixture of hunting season. To learn that it had ended in bloodshed shattered whatever comfort they had once taken in believing the disappearance was a tragic accident. Now, it was something far darker, a murder carried out in the very woods where children still played, where hunters still walked, never knowing what lay buried beneath their boots. For the family, the revelation was devastating but clarifying. They had spent years trapped between competing theories, their lives overshadowed by rumors of abandonment or misadventure. Now they knew the truth. He had not left them. He had not wandered aimlessly into the forest. He had been killed by someone he trusted, struck down in a moment of anger over something as small as territory. The compass that had once symbolized his guidance had become the clue that exposed the betrayal. The man who confessed was arrested and charged. His age, his frailty, did not absolve him of the crime. For the family, watching him led away was both a relief and a heartbreak. The truth had finally been spoken aloud, but it did not undo the years of silence, nor did it restore what they had lost. What lingered most was the image of betrayal, that their father, husband, and friend had walked into the woods alongside a man he trusted, only to be left buried in a marsh, his compass shoved into the mud like a secret meant never to be told. And though justice was now possible, the family was left with the chilling knowledge that the truth had been there all along, waiting beneath the soil, waiting in the memory of a man who carried his guilt for 14 years until the forest finally gave up its silence. When the confession was made official and charges were filed, the family finally had the truth they had both longed for and dreaded. For 14 years they had lived in a state of suspension, caught between the hope that he might walk back through the door and the fear that he never would. Now they knew with certainty. He had not abandoned them. He had not wandered away to start a new life. He had not gotten lost in the woods he knew so well. He had been murdered, struck down in a sudden, senseless act of violence. The revelation brought a complicated kind of closure. His wife, who had endured years of whispers and sideways glances, felt a wave of vindication. For so long, rumors had suggested he had staged his own disappearance, that he had chosen to leave her and their son. Now, those rumors could finally be put to rest. The truth was darker, but also cleaner. He had been taken from them. He had not chosen to go. Yet that knowledge did not soften the pain. If anything, it sharpened it. To know he had walked into the woods beside a friend, trusting, only to have his life ended over a dispute as trivial as hunting boundaries, was a cruelty beyond imagination. For his son, the truth was equally heavy. The boy who had once whispered his father's last words, "I'll be back before dark," now carried the weight of knowing that promise had been broken not by choice, but by betrayal. He had spent years resenting his father in quiet moments, wondering if he had chosen to leave, if he had been less committed to his family than he claimed. Now he knew better. The man he loved had been taken from him violently, his memory stained not by cowardice or abandonment, but by the anger of someone who should have been his companion. The bitterness he carried turned into grief, the kind that cut deeper now that the truth was laid bare. The community, too, struggled with the revelation. For years they had repeated the story as a cautionary tale. Don't stray too far. Don't underestimate the woods. Don't assume experience guarantees safety. Now that narrative collapsed. The danger had not been the forest. The danger had been another man, a neighbor, a friend. The realization unsettled them in a way that natural explanations never could. A storm, a fall, a wild animal. Those were things one could guard against. But betrayal, hidden behind familiar faces, could not be anticipated. The compass became a symbol in the aftermath. Once just a tool for navigation, passed down from father to son, it was now the very object that had broken the silence. Buried to conceal the crime, it had resurfaced to reveal it. It was the clue that pulled the truth from the ground, the guide that led investigators back to the man who had wielded the fatal blow. For the family, it was painful to look at, but impossible to let go. The son kept it close, not just as a reminder of his father, but as proof that his story had been set straight. In the courtroom, the details were laid bare. The confession, the fractures in the bones, the evidence of concealment, all of it painted a picture of rage and panic on a quiet hunting trail. The motive was as petty as it was devastating. A disagreement over territory, an argument that escalated into violence. The man responsible wept as he recounted it, but his tears did little to soften the impact. For the family, apologies came too late. No words could undo the years of silence. No expression of regret could restore the birthdays, the milestones, the countless moments stolen by a single impulsive act. When the verdict was reached, justice felt hollow. The family walked away not with triumph, but with a truth that was difficult to hold. They had answers, yes, but those answers carried no comfort. The wound of absence remained, deepened now by the knowledge of how senselessly it had been inflicted. His wife said later that closure was not the right word. Closure suggested something ending. But for her, grief did not end with the truth. It only shifted shape. The community carried its own burden. The case became a reminder that violence often wears familiar faces. They looked back on the years they had spent repeating rumors, some doubting the missing man's character, others convinced he had chosen to leave. Now they had to face the fact that they had been wrong. He had not walked away. He had been betrayed. That realization rippled through them, a reminder of how easily trust can fracture, how quickly anger can turn lethal. In the end, the truth was as dark as the title that had shadowed the story. The father who vanished had been murdered over nothing more than a hunting boundary. The compass that was meant to guide him home became the very object that brought him back, 14 years later, when the forest could no longer keep its silence. For the family, the grief endured, but so did the knowledge that his memory was no longer tainted by doubt. He had not abandoned them, he had been taken from them. And though the truth was brutal, it was a truth at last.